Who is that? No. Wait a minute. Calm down now. Who is that?
I know you were going to say that. No.
Who is that?
It's of no importance now. Pay
It's
no
important to me. Now, who is it?
That's Carl, dear.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Jeff June, who is the CEO and founder of Ischemia Care, which is an AI startup specializing in diagnostic blood tests for stroke and atrial fibrillation. So I want to welcome Jeff today.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
So your background, I believe, is in private equity, VC, really more of more of Wall Street and financier. How did your fate intersect with stroke care?
I think that's a great question, Scott. That's a great place to start. So I like to think of my career as different stages that really overlapped. I started my career at Deloitte, very large company. I worked within a company that I did not found that was an initial public offering. And then from that point forward, I started working with high growth ventures. Then you'll begin to see a track of everything that I was working with had some kind of math or science component associated with it. I think it was the learning from early stage ventures, believe it or not, that really turned me against private equity and venture capital. And the funny thing was, so my career spans 30 years, it was really meeting the right people. And I think when you look at over the course of my career, it's being part of great teams with great people. And I think the track that took me into private equity and venture capital was I became connected with those people, and it really became a great foundation for learning a lot and seeing a lot of really innovative ventures. There's another part of my career that involved being a professor and chair at a major university. I don't come from an academic background, but I became a professor and chair in entrepreneurship, teaching engineering and digital development courses as well. So I've always been inspired by this, being a lifelong learner. And I think that when you come from the investment side, there's a few pieces to it. And I think part of it is you have to have a very strong math and science background, but you really have to have this ability to see things that other people don't see. I think part of it comes from being exposed to a variety of different experiences. And so I think when you put together my background in terms of my, large company experience, I worked for a very large private equity fund and also for a very small venture fund. I saw a significant amount of things. And then you tie into that the teaching. Ischemia Care really became the culmination of that, because when you think about ultimately what you're doing, you're really trying to see the future of healthcare. But ultimately, it's ultimately grounded in math and science. And so you're really trying to take a creative approach to looking at things like RNA expression and artificial intelligence and machine learning and applying them to solve a really important problem in stroke.
Well, thank you for that background. I appreciate it. Let's get into the actual work that you guys are doing around the blood test that gives indication of potential stroke or cause of a stroke. You mentioned the RNA aspect in terms of sequencing. So the blood is actually ripe with a lot of information, RNA, which has to do with the blood aspect versus the genomics DNA aspects, has a lot of information there, and more so, it actually provides a real-time assessment. Genomics, I think the way someone explained it is, it's kind of an architect of a blueprint of where we came from and just kind of static information to a great extent. RNA, on the other hand, gives us a real-time snapshot of what's happening in our real system. How are you using this kind of data to be able to actually detect and determine cardioembolic strokes due to, atrial fibrillation and other things?
So you gave a tremendous background there. So in real simple sense, DNA is what you're born with, and RNA changes in response to things. So what we do is that we ran the base clinical trial, and this was based upon 10 years of peer-reviewed published research. So if I were to take a small step back, I met the inventors of the technology back when I was in venture and private equity and began to really understand the technology. So about 20 years ago, when RNA was in its infancy, it was being applied in cancer. And a lot of people were really trying to understand really how it could be applied. And now you look at today, it's commonplace in cancer, it's becoming commonplace more in cardiology, but we're the only company that is doing this in stroke. And so when you think about the link between cardioembolic stroke and atrial fibrillation, what we've done in our base clinical trial is that we recruited 1,700 subjects, and we recruit them from the point at which they present in the emergency room within 24 hours of symptom onset. And what we do is that we look at markers that are expressed differentially for that cause of stroke. So the test that we have on the market today is called ISCDX, and we look at 45 genes that are expressed differently for strokes that occur due to cardioembolic causes, which include atrial fibrillation, and those which are due to large artery atherosclerosis. And so this becomes really important because so imagine that there's 800,000 strokes, and in about 40% of those cases, the cause can never be determined, and it's called cryptogenic. Within that group are patients with undiagnosed atrial fibrillation. If you don't find those patients, they're at a 5 times greater likelihood of having a recurrent stroke that's going to be much more massive and debilitating. But if we can identify those patients with undetected AFib and medically manage them, they get a 60% risk reduction. So it's really about understanding what's changing within that patient by looking at a large group of patients and then being able to apply that in a way that can really improve the outcomes for these patients.
So tell us a little bit about the current status quo in terms of, how are stroke patients that are coming into the hospital in an urgent care situation being evaluated, and what is their screening for, a fib, like you said?
So today when a patient presents in the emergency room, so if I were to take a step back from the 800,000 patients, there's about 2 to 3 million patients that present with stroke and stroke-like symptoms. So immediately those patients are triaged to determine whether they're having an ischemic event or whether they're having something that's confused with stroke. Once a stroke patient is identified, they'll receive a CT scan, and a decision will be made whether they receive TPA or whether they will have a thrombectomy where they go and retrieve the clot. So TPA and thrombectomy applies to about 10% of all stroke patients, versus identifying the cause of stroke really applies to all stroke patients. Because of the 800,000 strokes that occur every year, about a quarter of those are recurrent events. And so what happens from that point when the patient is triaged and an interventional decision is made, that patient is going to be hospitalized between 4 and 15 days. And right now, there are no stratification tools. So imagine that you're a 40-year-old woman, you've had a stroke, you don't have complications and comorbidities. And if I'm not going too fast, Scott, or too deep for the audience, basically what will happen is that they will look at you and they will assess, do you have things like diabetes, thyroid condition, or existing AFib? If you have those things, that's your cause of stroke. Versus on the other side, if you have a history of large artery atherosclerosis and occlusion of your large vessel, you'd be diagnosed with large artery atherosclerosis. Patients are presenting younger and younger with these unknown causes of stroke. So today, the clinicians early on have to really make an educated guess as to which pathway they're going to work up these patients, which is binary. And just because you work up one pathway and it's negative, it doesn't mean it was automatically the other pathway. And so what happens in particular in these cases of cardioembolic or atrial fibrillation, the patient may not present with these things like diabetes, thyroid condition, things that are typical, let's call them tells for patients that may have atrial fibrillation. So what happens is that they may do some of these testing within hospital, but then when the patient is discharged, today they may receive an implantable cardiac monitor. And there's a lot of controversy around implantable cardiac monitoring because it was discovered that there's an 86% false positive rate within cryptogenic populations. And so you have this great controversy among clinicians that some people will do implantable cardiac monitoring on all patients because they feel it's in the best interest, even though it's highly inaccurate. Other clinicians won't use it because they feel that it's very low yield. If you just had a simple stratification tool like our test, it can help you identify the patients that may be candidates for this type of, further diagnosis and treatment. And then, if I may add one other thing, typically stroke care doesn't end in the hospital. It really is just the beginning of managing these patients appropriately, because if they do have a recurrent stroke, it's really important to realize it's going to be much more massive, debilitating, costly, greater burden on family members, and very debilitating for the patient themselves.
Yeah, thank you for the background. So there's a lot of aspects to kind of deconstruct a little bit, is that there are issues around the fact that right now it's kind of a, like I said, binary, and the treatments tend to really broadly classify people in big groups without necessarily having really detailed insight. And that's really what the RNA provides you, is an inside look at what's really happening and the causes and the probability of further risk. And then the other thing that you went into, but of course there's a really downside implication, is if people are having to stay in the hospital for a certain duration, that has cost both to the patient as well as to the ecosystem. If we can properly diagnose and understand the pathways, you effectively not only treat and prevent the diseases and the further implications, but also be able to manage the care in such a way that brings down the overall cost structure. And I think that's the kind of level of personalization that we're talking about, correct? What is Absolutely. The kind of response that you receive from the physicians as well as kind of the other stakeholders in the ecosystem?
We receive incredible response from our testing, and it has just been released in market. So we just completed the CLIA analytical validation process. Clinicians will always want to do what's in the best interest of patients. But you bring up a very important point. Just because, and I know this sounds a little unusual to say, just because you change care and can improve patient outcomes, it's not enough to get adopted in the hospital system. And building on what you said, is that we have to be able to demonstrate that we can effectively reduce costs by putting patients in the right pathway. But the challenge with the hospital system today is stroke is paid for under the DRG. And clinicians in hospitals have to make best decisions with those dollars. I think the other part of our adoption and our argument is that we have to work with the payers, because the recurrent stroke program is something that relates to the payers. And I may have gone a little bit longer, but the response to our testing is that clinicians are very excited about what we do. We ran our clinical trial at 20 hospital systems with some of the real leaders in the stroke field that really helped shape, before we even began enrolling patients, is thinking about what are the most important questions that we need to answer, and those are the ones that we focused on.
So I know you've referenced the clinical trial a couple of times. This is a biomarkers acute stroke etiology, where there were, like I said, there was about 20 different sites, 1,700 patients. Can you go into a little bit more depth around the parameter of the clinical trials and the kinds of findings that came out of it, and what's the implication for the research as well as your business?
I'd love to. So the base clinical trial was designed to answer these important questions in stroke. And so we enrolled patients that presented in the hospital within 24 hours of symptom onset. We had very limited exclusion criteria, meaning it was very real world, that was set up to really understand a really complex patient base. And it was designed to do 4 specific things when you think about the stroke care continuum. First, it was to address cause of stroke between large artery atherosclerosis and cardioembolic stroke, to address this cryptogenic question, which could be up to 40% of all stroke patients. The second thing, separate from cause of stroke, was atrial fibrillation. So it was to look at not just atrial fibrillation in stroke patients, but atrial fibrillation in everyone that showed up in the emergency room with stroke-like symptoms. The third thing we focus on is transient ischemic attacks. So a stroke is a permanent neurological deficit. A transient ischemic attack could be somebody wakes up with a numb arm, but it's transient in nature, and that symptom may resolve by the time they get to the hospital. Transient ischemic attacks are at high risk for ischemic stroke. So you begin to see the pattern of progression of that we can really identify stroke and make a huge difference in identifying these people that not just have strokes, but people that are at risk for stroke. And then we also look at transient neurological events, meaning that in the population that shows up in the emergency room, the clinician just knows that somebody is showing up and they may be unconscious and can't speak, or they have a vision deficit. some of those things can be caused by non-ischemic events called transient neurological events. So you have things like syncope, seizures, complex migraines. And so what we tried to do in the base clinical trial was really understand all patients that present in the emergency room and develop diagnostic testing and other tools that can really serve this patient population incredibly well.
Now, can you share a little bit about the FDA journey that you guys are on?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, diagnostic testing is governed under CLIA, so the Clinical Laboratory Improvements Amendment. And so we're in the CLIA program where we completed the analytical validation. CLIA oversees diagnostic testing in 260,000 clinical labs around the country. CLIA receives oversight from CMS, FDA, and CDC. Kind of a really interesting development, kind of sharing with you something that I don't think anyone knows, is that, so we're working with the FDA right now on an emergency use authorization for our ISCDX test, plus the COVID respiratory panel, plus the antibody test. And so what we're trying to do there, our FDA journey there, is that if we're able to receive this emergency use authorization, it's incredibly important because you have these younger patients that are presenting with stroke now, and the cause is very difficult to determine. We were bringing on the COVID testing component because I felt it was really important because we deal in immune responses. We have to understand complex patients and what is going on with them. But what we plan on doing with the FDA next is that while our testing today is run in a CLIA laboratory, what our goal within the next 12 months is to bring that test into the hospital laboratory. And that test being run in the hospital laboratory becomes a product, which then is a product that will go and receive FDA clearance. And the experience that we're gaining right now from the EUA, being the only company in the world that does blood testing for stroke, is really invaluable for us.
Very interesting and exciting milestones, and good luck with the emergency approval process. That is very interesting. I mean, the RNA, like you said, also gets into a lot into the immunology and the co-infection aspects as well. So great indicator. We're kind of short on time, but I do want to ask a question because I think it's interesting, is that as the clinical trials enlarge and you have a larger data set, you can start to have some sort of pattern recognition. And I wonder how you guys can use the data to give informative, predictive look in terms of, based on the analysis for a particular patient, how much more likely would this result in something more severe, and be able to take the right, not only diagnostic, but the therapeutic approach or pathway.
Scott, you just kind of laid out where we see ourselves going in the future. Absolutely. While what we do today is rooted in biology, when we ran the base clinical trial, we accumulated all of this clinical data, including 60 days out. So we included all the history of the patient, we included what was done in the hospital, and we included any follow-up as well. And we've now developed models where we can just look at the clinical data, and we know how the clinician is going to diagnose that patient. And it becomes incredibly valuable because we have to educate them on what biology is, because not that we have to educate them on biology, but we're the only company to ever bring a blood test for stroke into clinical practice. So we felt we had to understand, could we diagnose stroke just using the clinical data or just using the biological data? And you think about where we're going is that we can build these predictive models that help us really understand the patients. And then ultimately, all of these patients, they're incredibly complex. You have to come up with the right treatment program. And right now stroke is kind of treated as almost like a one size fits all. And you look at how precision medicine has impacted other industries, I think that we're going to have an incredible impact on that. So I think that what we try to do as a company is we really try to leverage this incredible amount of data to provide ultimately a digital solution that can help us manage these chronic patients. That's really going to drive a significant cost and really democratize stroke care across all centers and create a new standard of care. Whether that's ultimately us or it's another company, I feel that we're really blazing that trail. And I think ultimately the data that we develop can not just be used in diagnostics and identifying the right treatment pathway, but also developing new therapeutics. When you look at the therapeutic track record in stroke, it's awful. And I think part of the reason that this therapeutic pathway has been so challenged, it's really about putting the right patient with the right therapy. And if I may just add one more thing, it's there are these ESUS clinical trials that went on for a number of years where they were giving these NOACs, these anticoagulants, to cryptogenic patients. And what they found was that they were having the same amount of adverse events within that population as they previously had without the benefit. And so we need to be able to identify what is causing stroke. We need to develop the right therapies. And we need to develop a pathway where stroke and disability becomes a thing of the past. You know, we live in a world now where there's so much technology and so much ability to kind of improve the care of these patients. It's almost like heart attack in the 50s. It used to be thought when you had a heart attack that you had, your outcome was terrible, your mortality was going to be terrible. It's really where we are with stroke care now. And we really need to change that by applying data so that we can improve the care of these patients so that permanent disability and recurrent strokes become something of the past.
Terrific. So with that, I've been joined by Jeff Chun, who is the CEO of Ischemia Care. I want to thank you for joining today.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.